Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining today's CFS Live event. What does a return to normal look like? Understanding community sentiment. My name is James Hume. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Committee for Sydney and your moderator for today's discussion. It's an appropriate time for talking about a return to normal as the first wave of restrictions are lifted today across New South Wales. As you probably know from today, outdoor gatherings of up to 10 people will be allowed. You can have up to 5 visitors in a household at one time, and even cafes, restaurants and pubs are starting to open and seat up to 10 patrons at any one time. Throughout this pandemic, Newgate Research has published regular tracking polls looking at community attitudes to the coronavirus, and today we will hear from Newgate about their very latest polling published today, and then be joined by a panel of experts to talk about the figures and some of those broader questions about the impact of COVID-19 on our community. So before that, let me introduce Brian Tyson and Sue Verco from Newgate Research. Brian is partner of Newgate Australia and co-founder of Newgate Research. In a consulting career spanning 2 decades, he has come to be regarded as one of Australia's leading communications practitioners, and he is a board member of a number of August institutions within this city, including the Committee for Sydney and the Sydney Swans. Sue is Managing Director of Newgate Research and has nearly 20 years experience as a market researcher, research buyer and communications consultant in corporate, financial and political arenas. The format for today will be that both will present on their latest research and findings, and then we'll join the rest of the panel. So if I can just invite Brian and Sue to kick off with your presentation.
Thanks, James, and thanks very much for the opportunity, and hello to everyone listening in. I'm going to hand over to Sue, who's going to do most of the talking through the research presentation. I just thought I would just commence by explaining why we decided to do this initially. I think as the country was embracing the first sort of wave of concern around the coronavirus in sort of late January, February, we just thought it would be a good idea to initiate a sense of tracking research so that we could monitor the change in sentiment across Australia, and how this might be useful certainly for our clients, but perhaps even more broadly for governments and others, as they could get a sense of how the community is responding to both the impacts of the virus, economic impacts, and how government decisions might be impacted as a result of that. So that was our rationale. That was at the start of March, when it was pretty scary. It's been fascinating to watch the trends in sentiment shift over that time. And last night we released wave 10, so it's been going for 10 weeks now. It feels like it's been 10 years. But I'll hand over to Sue now to sort of take you through the last the wave tracker and give a sense of how the trends have been shifting over that time. And look forward to discussing that and some of the other broader issues afterwards.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Brian. I will just share my screen now with everyone. The tracker that Brian was speaking about, this latest wave was in field from Monday to Wednesday this week and had a sample size of over 1,200 Australians. So just run you through some of the high level findings. When we start off this tracker, we ask people, what's the #1 issue facing Australia that you're currently most concerned about? And it won't surprise you to know that coronavirus is #1, but the proportion mentioning coronavirus has dropped quite considerably. And this week, 47% of people mentioned it as #1. And the economy and recession is really coming up there. Climate change is still an ongoing theme, but it has dropped slightly down the issues agenda as this process has gone forward. We do also ask a question, a prompted question, presenting a list of concerns and asking people to rate their level of concern about those things. And last week, for the first time, we found that concern about the economy overtook concern about coronavirus. So I think that probably what we're seeing is a bit of a change in focus to the economy, because it's not that people have become a lot more concerned about economic impacts per se. it's probably more so they've become less concerned about coronavirus. So just looking at a couple more details here, we have been asking people about their level of concern with a range of specific aspects of coronavirus. And we've got the benchmark. The results here show the benchmark study, which was 10 weeks ago, last week and this week. About the top 5 or 6 of these are all economic concerns. You'll see there concerns about the overall economic impact, jobs, unemployment, entering a recession and so forth. And concern about infections and deaths across the community or someone in your immediate family catching it are considerably lower. We also ask people how they personally have been affected by coronavirus, whether they've been in that particular week. And you can see that there's still a lot of people experiencing quite considerable impacts. At the top there, between 80 and 82% of people this week are still saying that they're staying home more than they usually would. They're avoiding all non-essential contact with people outside the home and so forth. I think that in terms of the impacts that people are experiencing, last week we saw a significant drop in quite a range of these different measures. So it appears that as with talk of restrictions about to be eased and some early easing of restrictions and allowing other people to visit their home, that did actually make a significant impact in how people felt. But you've still got relatively high proportions of people feeling isolated, 58% more than usual and so forth. We also this week asked a question about how people's financial situation in their household had changed due to COVID-19 and whether or not they felt it was much better than it was before, if it was worse than it was before. And you can see here that 11% actually said their financial situation was slightly better than before, and 43% slightly or much worse than before, and 46% said it was the same. You can't really say that a certain demographic group is experiencing, is having a worse time than others. It's very hard. It's a very mixed experience, particularly young people. Young people are actually just as likely to say, are more likely than others to say they're much better off, and they're also more likely to say they're worse off. If you're looking at sort of generalizations, those who are worse off, they tend to be people that are looking after the elderly, people speaking a language other than English at home, senior managers and office workers. People in WA are pretty much more likely to be in the middle, not really experiencing anywhere near as much impact. This question has been quite a key one in how we interpret the results. We've been asking people overall, do they think that Australia is overreacting to the issue of coronavirus, not taking the issue seriously enough, or responding at an appropriate level? And you can see the proportion that say that we're responding at an appropriate level is very high and has been maintained. So I guess that's something we've been watching closely to see if we're going to get a bit of a kick up in terms of people saying that we're overreacting or not responding, appropriately, but we haven't seen that as yet. And these findings are reinforced by a few other data points through the survey as well.
I think it's just on that point, Sue. I think it's worth highlighting around week 2 and week 3 in the tracker, where we started to see the real spike and increase in incidences of infection rates, and that's when I think the rubber hit the road for a lot of people, that this thing was real. It was going to really have a big impact on this country, and you can see that there's a big shift in concern around not taking the issue seriously enough, and obviously the government responses from that point on have been pretty robust and pretty uniform, really, and that's probably why we've seen this consistent high level of support for the reaction since. Yeah.
We also have asked people about their predictions, I guess, how they expect the spread of coronavirus in Australia will change over different timeframes. We asked this both for virus spread and for the economy. So you can kind of see there that people have got a little bit more confident about the virus spread over time. But if you look at the 3 months mark, the purple is the proportion of people that say it's going to get better in 3 months, and the orange is the proportion who say it's going to get worse. And you're actually seeing a tapering of optimism just in the last week. So that to me is suggesting that messages about a potential wave are cutting through. And people are starting to think, okay, we still actually have to be careful here, not as optimistic. So that's a significant change from last week. In terms of predictions about the economy, we're just seeing gradual optimism. So I think that's important to think about when the second chart that I showed you showing that concern about the economy has increased. It's not that they're getting a lot more concerned. I think, as I said, it's the focus has shifted. I mean, people certainly are concerned about economic impacts, but there is sort of a gradual sense that we're doing okay, particularly in relation to other countries. We have been also looking at the performance of a whole range of different Australian organisations and industries. We've sort of got the government generically there, the health system. The people that are performing the strongest is the health system, which is very impressive in terms of confidence in the health system overall. Supermarkets are very much up there. I think it's very visual. People are very experiential. People can see what supermarkets are doing a lot more than they can see what a lot of other industry sectors are doing. The government is seen as performing strongly, as are the police.
Even the media went up.
Well, yeah. The media are always down the bottom, but that's sort of, that's always a tricky one. I think at the moment, in terms of the media, people are just generally focused. I think there's been a return to quality, in terms of quality journalism. People really just want honest, transparent, scientific-based information, and without any scaremongering
or opinion. Yeah.
Yes, opinion. We are getting very high results in terms of the proportions of people who think that the government's restrictions are fair and reasonable. The government's taking appropriate measures, both to support people's health and for businesses. They're clearly communicating. And that's remained consistent week on week over the last few weeks. So that's very interesting to watch. There is down the bottom a couple of questions around what people think, whether people think that others in the community aren't taking social distancing seriously enough. And that's actually quite important to watch, because I think people take a lot of cues that if other people are breaking restrictions, maybe I'll break restrictions as well. But I've got some other data, which I'll show you in a moment, to say that most people are actually doing the right thing. We've got 33% at the very bottom who are saying that the coronavirus restrictions are making their day-to-day life very difficult. That dropped last week. Last week it was 33%, but the week before it was 40%. So that gradual easing of restrictions that I mentioned has certainly made a significant difference. And those people who say that their day-to-day life is most difficult, it tends to be young people and people living in inner city areas. So this is that question I mentioned before about the level of adherence with restrictions. And we asked that for the first time this week. It's actually quite interesting. Only 8% of people say they've been more relaxed than what's required. You've got 49% of people saying they're consistent with what's required. And you've got their 43% actually saying they're a little or a lot more careful than required. So, I mean, it is an online survey, so no one's talking to an interviewer. I think that they're being truthful there. If you look at who's doing those different behaviours, interestingly, younger people are actually, they fall in both ends. A lot of young people are actually just as likely as people aged over 55 to be more careful than is required, although of course there are also some of them, they're also more likely to be more relaxed than is required. The people that are being a lot more careful than required includes people who can work from home, and also people who speak a language other than English. The 49% in the middle tend to be people middle-aged people. People aged 35 to 54 are doing exactly what they're told. We asked a question, so we did also ask a question about the expectation of timing the easing of restrictions. After the roadmap and the 3 steps were announced late last week, just before we went into field, we asked people what they thought the expected timing was of moving into step 1, step 2 and step 3. And we did also look at this by state. I think what it probably shows overall, if you look at the data as a whole, that there was certainly some confusion initially about which step people were in. But it's interesting, if you look at step 3, people are not expecting that we're going to be rushing into step 3. We've got 40% of people saying it's going to be the next 3 months, and you've got another 30% of people saying it's going to take 6 months or more. And there's quite a lot of differentiation also between state with that. New South Wales is more conservative, more likely to say, if you add that up, that's 70% in 3 months or more. New South Wales is 77%, whereas WA is 44%. So it's quite nuanced on a state-by-state basis. We asked a question a few weeks ago. We were sort of thinking about, what the new normal would look like. So we asked an open-ended question, of all the different behaviour changes that you may have made as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, which are the ones that will really stick with you? Which are the ones that you will maintain? And in the open-ended response, the number one thing was, I'll wash my hands more often. You know, people like maintaining new standards of hygiene, or I'm going to social distance more often. I'm really going to keep my distance. So, you know, not shaking hands and things like that. But we decided there were so many interesting things there. We decided to prompt people, I guess, with a list of things and ask them, you know, which of the following things do you think you'll maintain most post-pandemic? So, you know, a lot of people talked about supporting local businesses more. They talked about limiting their spending and saving more money. I mean, I think for some of them, for some people, I think that's the experience of perhaps having a severe financial impact. But for others, they've actually worked out that they can actually be quite happy, you know, spending less money and doing different things. You've got all those aspirational things about eating more healthily, cooking more, taking more regular exercise, certainly spending more time with family and friends has come up. One of the, you know, using public transport less inevitably has come up. And then there are some things there about working from home more often. And so I just want to finish up by just touching on the shopping and the working from home before we open up to questions. So in terms of changing to shopping habits, people are saying, when we ask a more detailed question on this, that they think they'll be more likely to shop at their local stores than in the past. I think it'll be interesting to see about the extent to which that actually happens, because the proportion who've said that has dropped significantly from last week to this week. Certainly, I think, you know, the experiences of more people shopping online will maintain. And I guess it's not surprising that there are fewer people saying that they will shop at large shopping centres and in the CBD, I guess just until crowds dissipate and because of public transport concerns.
But I think just on that point, Sue, it's obviously people have discovered their local community again, and
yeah,
they liked what they saw in many respects. So it will be interesting to see how much it bounces back.
Yeah, and I think a lot of awareness of local businesses doing it tough and trying to do the right thing to support them. So just to finish up a few slides on working from home, we asked people for the last few weeks, you know, what time frames do they expect to be going back to their usual workplace in some capacity? And every week we ask it, people kind of push out, you know, when they expect to be going back. But again, you can see here that people aren't expecting to rush back. You know, you've got some people think they'll be back. Remember, it's some capacity in May, another 23% in June, but a lot of people are thinking it'll be the second half of the year. So we also ask people about, you know, what types of measures will make you feel more comfortable going back to work? How important are these things? Pretty much they said, oh, they're all important. You know, a lot of deep cleaning, hand sanitizers, social distancing, you know, but also the option to work from home some days and staggered work hours. We explored this week in a bit more detail expectations about working from home, and found that, you know, I guess the overall data hides the detailed nuance, but certainly you can see there the dark purple is the proportion spending no days a week at home. You can see 56% before COVID, looks like dropping to 47% post-COVID. But also there you can see people who've never worked from home on the right. 22% of those who've never worked from home in the past say they do expect to do some work from home post-COVID. And I've got one more slide on this, which is quite interesting, that shows of the people who could work from home, 26% say they will increase their working from home days post-COVID. But if you just look at office workers, it's 34%. And of those who want to increase their working from home days, about half say they want to do it maybe just 1 day a week at home. And the other half is kind of split between 2 days or 3 days or more. And those most interested in working from home live in metro areas, but they don't have school-aged children at home. There's no surprises there. They're more likely to live with an elderly family member or a friend, more likely to have a university degree, and more likely to speak a language other than English at home. So just to wrap up, the very final question we asked was, you know, what advice do you have for Australia's government and business leaders on how to best manage coronavirus and its flow-on effects? It was an open-ended question that we coded. Until this week, the number one has always been restrict people from entering other countries, close our borders. But this week we've kind of have that the only early sign of some sort of tension about whether or not we should ease restrictions or increase restrictions as the top two things there. You know, with two different views emerging, but as you've seen, that isn't really flowing through the rest of the data, with people overall still confident that Australia's taking the right approach. I'll hand back to you, James.
Great, Brian and Steve, thank you so much. It's an enormous amount to unpack in those figures. So I would like to bring in a couple more people to our panel, and we're very fortunate to be joined by them. And just a reminder to you watching at home, if you'd like to submit any questions, you can do so via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let me now introduce firstly Sarah Cruickshank, who is Deputy Secretary for Transformation at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in New South Wales. Sarah is a highly experienced public servant and previously served as Chief of Staff to the New South Wales Premier and has held senior positions in the departments of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra, and also has previously had a successful career in PR and communications. Joining her on the panel is Dr. Rebecca Huntley, one of Australia's foremost social researchers, as well as being an author, broadcaster and commentator. She is head of Vox Populi Research, and for 9 years was director of the Mind and Mood Report, Australia's longest running social trends report. And she is also author of numerous books, including Still Lucky, and her forthcoming book on how to talk about climate change is published at the end of June. I want to start with Sarah and Rebecca. Enormous amounts of data and issues raised in those numbers. But if I could just start with Sarah, I mean, you've been at the epicenter of dealing with this crisis. It's been an incredibly difficult start to the year for people in New South Wales and for the whole of the country, with bushfires and floods and now the pandemic. How do you feel the community has adapted to what has been a pretty terrible year so far?
It's what an understatement, James. And by the way, thanks very much for inviting me to participate, and hello to everybody. I actually heard the Premier say a couple of days ago, if someone had said to her last year that 2020 would start with bushfires, continue with floods, and then go into a pandemic, her response was going to be, what science fiction book have you been reading? So yeah, it goes without saying that 2020 is shaping up to be an incredibly challenging year for people. And to your point, I actually think the resilience and the ability for people to band together at the community level, whether it was during the bushfires or during the storms that we had in some parts of Sydney, and then now during the coronavirus, has actually been quite satisfying. It's been incredibly challenging to watch what people are going through, but you actually do get a sense that there is a genuine togetherness and camaraderie-ness, and Brian even referred to it a minute ago, there's even this strong sense of community, whether it's supporting your local community, doing the right thing by your local community, engaging with the local community, and just getting closer to family in particular. So yeah, I think someone else said to me yesterday, they actually hope it's one of those silver linings that comes out of COVID, that it actually makes us a nicer society going forward. So that's probably the optimistic side of how you'd respond to that.
Thank you. And Rebecca, within the presentation, it highlighted quite substantial trust in government and the decision-making that government is making. You recently described the public response to the COVID app as extraordinarily compliant. Do you think that will last? And what are your general reflections on the way people are trusting government at the moment?
Look, I think there is, some of the international data shows that even in countries where leadership has not been great and where there's been a much, much higher infection rate and death rate, there has been a kind of lift for trust in government. And in a sense, if we look at it from a psychological group psychology perspective, there's this general sense that in a crisis, you have to turn to somebody. So there's a little bit of that happening. But I think what happens in places like Australia and New Zealand, and some of the data coming out in terms of how Australians rate different leaders in different countries as being effective leaders, and they've looked at New Zealand and they've looked at Australia, in a sense, success reinforces trust. So what has happened is this is kind of reinforced in Australians that sense of Anzac exceptionalism, which is that we get affected globally, but for whatever reason, not as badly as everybody else? And is it because we are essentially not particularly hung up on the idea that for a short period of time we'll be told what to do? We'll be told to stay home, and largely we will stay home. Even though there was that one protest in Victoria recently, we haven't seen widespread protests of people saying, you know, my rights are being infringed. And in fact, all of the data shows that Australians are prepared to actually do quite a bit in terms of behaviour modification, in terms of suspending things, in order to get, for everybody to kind of get through this process. Now, the question is, you know, what's the long tail of that? You know, if we do manage to kind of avoid a second wave and we move much more into rocky economic times, are people going to kind of sustain that kind of larger, bigger, wider focus and continue perhaps to, for some people, pay more tax, for other people lower their expectations about what their lifestyle is going to be like? I mean, Australians are notorious for thinking that an international trip is almost like a birthright of being a middle-class Australian. Are we going to kind of say, well, not only is that not feasible, that's probably, you know, not going to be something that I can afford to do? So the long tail for me is what's fascinating, not necessarily how people respond in a crisis, because it's, you know, we've seen lots of examples of people doing this for short periods of time. It's about the longer impact.
I'll open this question up to the whole panel, but just leading on from that, as Brian and Sue talked about, concerns around the economy are increasing within the public, and you know, there's a creeping sense that, or a creeping realization that we are about to go into an incredibly difficult economic period. The unemployment figures this week were, you know, absolutely horrendous. It will be the first time for many people in Australia to have felt real economic hardship, and it will be the first recession in almost 30 years. How do you think the community is going to cope with what could be quite prolonged economic hardship? And I know, Brian, Sue, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. No, I think you're right. I mean, we have had 27, 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and so there's a big section of the working community and the broader community that's never experienced economic hardship. So I think it will be a real trying point. And I don't think we have a full appreciation of how difficult it's going to be just yet. I think our research showed that there was elements of a more optimism about how long the downturn would last, and that there was a sense that we could be through the worst of it sooner rather than later. But then you reference that against you know, the real data around JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and that I saw some information there yesterday. 6 million people are on JobKeeper, so we're effectively being underpinned by the government. That ends in September. That's a big cliff, and once we get to that point, you know, people are reasonably reassured about their lifestyles at the moment because they're being underpinned by this subsidy of sorts. You know, it's starting to dawn on people that this isn't forever, and we have to deal with the outcome of that. And I know that's obviously Sarah might have a view on this, but that's the biggest issue I would imagine confronting governments as they think about the importance of getting the economy started again, because it will be absolutely uncharted territory for so many people. And, you know, I think Australians, to Rebecca's earlier point, you know, we are pretty resilient and we're pretty compliant and we have a tendency to do the right thing. But to what point and to what extent will we be able to continue to do that? That's the big question, I think.
Sarah, did you have any on this?
Yeah, sure. Quite happy to. I mean, Brian's exactly right. It's the kind of thing that genuinely keeps people awake at night, thinking not so much about what the short-term support is that government needs to provide to business and individuals, but what does the disruption of COVID mean for the economy going forward? And as a number of people have already said, but it's worth reflecting on, it is going to be the first time in a generation that there has been a significant economic slowdown. And when you look back to those previous economic slowdowns, there's a couple of areas of particular risk. One of them is people who are young people today. They're either at school or they are at university now, or maybe learning a trade now. They're the ones that are potentially going to find it very hard to actually enter the workforce. And previous, history has shown that if you struggle to enter the workforce after a period of 2 to 3 years, you may never get in. So that's a really challenging situation for the cohort of people that will be impacted by there. And then the other group of people are people that are in industries that were already under pressure. When you have a disruption like COVID come along, it's unlikely those people, and they're often in their middle age, but they may not be anywhere near ready to retiring. It's unlikely they will be able to re-enter the workforce either. So you end up with those two cohorts. There's also been some interesting work done around the gender side of things as well. That's the side, and just to spell that out, there's a number of industries that have been hit the hardest. They happen to be female-dominated industries as well, and often with mature age women in there as well. So again, if you look back on the history of economic activities in Australia, one of the hallmarks of the last 50 years has been the growing financial independence of women, but particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, that's another sort of disruption that I suspect historians in the future will look back and say there was a backward step that happened there for a large cohort of women in Australia. It's always worth reflecting on the fact, though, this is happening everywhere around the world, and I guess again, desperately looking for some optimism. Other countries are in exactly the same situation in terms of the issues they're dealing with, but we in Australia are in a better position economically to be able to deal with it. That's probably the only positive I can say about that, though. Can't emphasise enough how challenging the economic side of things is going to be for the coming years. And the displacement of workers is the thing that people are focused on as well. There's a huge number of opportunities around new industries, the weaknesses in the supply chains globally, all the things that most of this audience probably knows about already. But there's a bunch of opportunities undoubtedly for new industries in Australia, and industries like manufacturing and high-end manufacturing that we thought would probably have left our shores forever. We now have a new opportunity to bring that back in, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to be able to have a job. And it's that's the challenge that the federal government and all the state governments and territory governments have ahead of them. How do you make sure you're doing everything you possibly can to help the economy recover and help ensure that people actually have jobs and meaningful jobs for the rest of their sort of professional lives? So yeah, it's a big challenge. It's the place to be, a public policy sense.
It is, and from a social research perspective, I mean, it must be absolutely fascinating. But Rebecca, in your book, Still Lucky, you painted a picture of a nation that's fairly relaxed and comfortable. How is it going to deal with this economic juggernaut that's about to hit it?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the more fascinating questions is just listening to Sarah talk about the impact on, let's say, women workers of COVID and the oncoming economic long tail. Is that one of the things that's fascinated me, if you kind of think about, who have been the essential workers during this kind of crisis. So, while there's certainly Deliveroo and people like that have been significant, and obviously we've still had agriculture and all the rest of it. If we think about some of those frontline healthcare staff, cleaners, really suddenly critically important, and teachers, as well as we know that women are far more likely to be working from home and homeschooling children. So keeping that, to the extent to which any of that education can stay on track, women have been taking on more of that responsibility. Now, we know that a lot of those industries, not all of them, but a lot of those industries are industries where there is still a gender pay gap. So I'm really interested coming out of this, whether Australians have a slightly different understanding of who are the essential workers in our community, whether they get remunerated in balance with their value, and whether the kinds of industries that we imagine keep the Australian economy going through crises and through good times are the industries that are in fact those industries. So one of the things that is fascinating to me is that the first sector that really got impacted by COVID, other than tourism, was the tertiary education sector. And there's absolutely no evidence that in the tertiary education sector that they're going to go back to normal anytime this year, right? They'll probably continue to teach online until the end of the year. It's really exposed the extent to which that industry is actually absolutely critical to the Australian, as an employer, as an exporter of services, as somebody that's as an industry that underpins research, innovation, including healthcare research, but how underfunded it's been by government and how undervalued, including the fact that in many cases, I think in almost all cases, university staff have been left out of JobKeeper. So I'm just really fascinated coming out of this, whether we really recognise that the kinds of, the critical nature of that industry, the critical nature of it being underfunded, as well as the extent to which we really, there's tons of memes going around Instagram talking about, how parents recognise just the incredible job that teachers do and they should all be paid $1 million a year to have to put up with our kids. But, I think that that's a joke, but at the heart of that is a real insight about how important those workers are at a time of crisis and at a time of business as usual as well.
Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions that have come in from people watching. I'm going to combine two sort of related. One, and perhaps one for Brian and Sue, and then the other panelists come in. Whether there was any evidence from the survey about the industries that the public think should be getting particular support. A lot of discussion about bailing out airlines, a lot of discussion about support for the construction sector, but whether there was any particularly strong support from the public for any particular industries or sectors. And related to that, there's a question about the arts and how on earth the arts and culture is going to be supported through this crisis and to rebuild over the next few months and years. So I'm going to ask Brian and Sue to sort of kick off and then invite the other panelists to comment.
Maybe if I just comment first and say, unfortunately, we don't have anything specific in terms of, we haven't explored that particular issue about support for particular industries in the study. But I think in terms of the arts returning to normal, I think the key challenge is going to be where people's priorities are in terms of the first things they're going to do once restrictions ease, and the fact that a lot of arts types experiences involve social distancing is problematic, I guess. I think the first things that people are going to do is go and visit their family or friends, in regional areas or nearby. They want to catch up with their friends, and people talk about going to pubs and things like this, mostly as a proxy for catching up. They want to get out of the restrictions of their home. But art seems to be a little bit further away, I think, from what we've seen so far.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. And so we're doing some research in other areas around this issue, and I think arts and attendance at museums and galleries and events and concerts, etc. People are sort of seeing that as perhaps more in the phase 3 lockdown restrictions lift. I think they're not immediate. That's not the immediate thing that they're going to do. They're going to do some of the very mundane things like see their friends, see their family. I think I know governments are very focused on how arts communities, etc., and institutions can start to function again. But I think in the shorter term, that's not certainly top of mind for a lot of the people that we've been speaking to in the surveys.
And I guess, James, if I can jump in, it's true that there are, what would you call it? There are health issues around large gatherings, obviously, for quite a significant time. And I heard somebody just recently give me a very detailed explanation, which was quite graphic in understanding what it is that actually makes, a major sporting event or a huge rock concert or whatever dangerous. But it basically goes down to the vapours that people release to the dense crowds around them. But it's the first time I'd actually really ever thought about that. But the point I would make is what we are trying to do at New South Wales government level is try to separate out cultural institutions like, art galleries and museums and places that are more conducive to crowd control from the major arts and concerts and sporting events, because exactly as Brian and Sue say, we're a while away from that. But if there's a way to bring forward some of the public cultural institutions that at least become destinations for people to visit and learn and get some enjoyment, then we'll try and do that. But exactly as Brian said, people's priorities are friends and family at this point and just getting outside. But we'll try to stagger it a little bit.
Rebecca, when do you think you'll be performing a Giant Dwarf again?
Well, I'm actually on the board of Bell Shakespeare, and, you know, it was utterly heartbreaking, you know, to know that it takes about 12 to 18 months to get a season in train, to make the decision about what will be played, about where it will be played, and Bell had put on really quite an extraordinary Hamlet, with a woman playing Hamlet, and got maybe 2 weeks. And of course, you know, even if there was some kind of miracle and we would be in a position of putting people in a socially distanced theatre space outside, you still have the long train of kind of getting everybody in place. And of course, we tend to think that with the arts, we're just thinking about, you know, very artistic, you know, actors and all the rest of it who like to, you know, who've made a choice to be able to do that decision. But what we're also talking about is the administrative staff, is the people that run the venue, is the people that provide the food. You know, there's an ecosystem around the arts that is really, really important, and that's being affected as well. And particularly for arts workers more broadly, they are people who've been, you know, they're people whose knowledge and understanding of the industry has been built up over time. And if you can't retain those people and the understanding that they have about what it is to run an arts organisation, then it is really, you know, a lot of, I mean, the arts is underfunded in Australia generally, and so this has been a huge impact. And of course, the question is, when there are so many competing priorities, which are around health, housing, education, all the rest of it, issues that really face people who are already struggling. So perhaps they're living with a disability, perhaps there are issues around language, then, you know, it seems like the arts is a luxury. But how we interpret this experience and how we get through crises, the arts more broadly is such an important thing for everybody to understand and for everybody to find a way to interpret what that means. And if Australia is ever going to be a tourist destination again, it's an important part of it. So, you know, I've been kind of thinking about what we can do and what we need to do ongoing to support our arts workers and creative content in Australia as we, again, go through an economic crisis and competing demands on government, which are going to be difficult.
Rebecca, I'll stay with you, because another question that's come in related to your forthcoming book. Do we think that community and government listening to science and data around COVID will impact the government policy and community sentiment around climate change?
Yeah.
Essentially, will people listen to science and rational arguments? Yeah.
Well, there was an interesting slide in Brian and Sue's work, wasn't there, about that question. Can you remind me what that said, Sue? It was like a second tier.
Well, basically, climate change has sort of tracked down gradually during the course, but from about 65% concern to about 55% concern. So it's up there, but it's down a little bit.
But there was another slide about valuing evidence and information. Yeah. So that was in kind of, people thought that was going to be a kind of second tier impact.
Yeah.
So there's been quite a lot that's been said about that, and it's speculative, I've got to say. It's this idea that the increasing trust in government that we've seen, this kind of lift, is not just a kind of natural consequence of crisis, or necessarily just because we're managing to do better than other countries. That people are really appreciating suddenly the kind of suspension, to some extent, although it's come back a bit, of partisanism on a question, and that you've got experts, you know, whether that be medical officers or epidemiologists, front and centre, standing alongside decision makers, making decisions based on science and evidence. Now, I'll need to see more to feel like I know that that's something that's happening. But I definitely think in the research that I've done over the years is that people do yearn for the idea that politicians listen to experts and listen to people who know what they're talking about. And if you notice, and I've really noticed this, is that there has, in America, there has been a lot of traction from the right-wing media about a really pushback against the idea of science-led decision-making in terms of lockdown. And there's tried to be a little bit of that in the right-wing media in Australia, and there really hasn't been much traction. None of those people who are running that line have managed to really get a lot of airtime, or I mean, it's not, they've got airtime, but a lot of public support for those ideas. And again, if you look at Sue and Brian's slides, you're talking, it was almost like single digits thinking that governments are overreacting to COVID, right? But that is very much the right-wing media line in America, that this is a massive overreaction. And basically they say, you know, if a whole lot of grandmas and grandpas and people with asthma have to die so we can keep the economy going, so be it, you know. But that's not something that's taken hold in Australia. So I think that there is going to be, and this is the work that I'm about to embark on, there's going to be a kind of spectrum of views about whether climate action is going to be something that can be folded into economic recovery, or that we have to make a decision between one or the other. And I think that will be a really interesting debate that will be happen ongoing as we move out of COVID and into yet another bushfire season, which I don't want to scare people, is going to start in about October. So we you know, and that's not too far away. So I think that will be interesting. It'll be interesting too to see whether one of the hangovers from COVID is people do want to hear more, and they do have a bit more respect and understanding for what scientists can bring to a complex, you know, economic problem, a complex social problem, and a complex political problem.
Can I jump in on that, James?
Yeah, of course.
Right? Yeah. I was just going to say, I couldn't echo more strongly the points that Rebecca's just made, because it's been quite refreshing to actually see what I would regard as a kind of maturity of the public discourse over the last sort of 6 or 8 weeks. And public discourse that, exactly as she said, it's led by politicians, but it's also got the experts standing shoulder to shoulder with them. My other observation on the climate change stuff, and it's been a few years since I've worked in this space, but there used to be an argument put forward that, you know, Australia will never be able to be a massive sort of renewable energy industry type country because it costs too much to produce things. But the point that I made before about the changing of supply chains and the changes to globalisation, I actually think it puts fair and square all of the possible industry development opportunities that we've got great research in. We've got some really innovative countries. We can actually go back down that path of, you know, manufacturing and generating environmentally sustainable product here in Australia and making the most of it, whether it's energy, whether it's the manufacturing of products that sit underneath it, or basically even just moving towards the sort of more sustainable city build type thing. So I actually think there is an incredible opportunity, as long as we don't lose sight of it as one of the industry sectors where there's a real opportunity for Australia. So
yeah, absolutely.
Sarah, can I, there's a related question just about National Cabinet, which seems to have been a fantastic success, you know, getting politicians from different geographical areas, from different political allegiances, you know, together in the national interest. Do you have sort of any reflections of why it's worked so well and how it might work in the future?
Yeah, well, interesting. And I suspect that Prime Minister and Premiers will be thinking about this very issue at the moment anyway. The reality is, it sounds condescending to say it, I think the entire political leadership cohort has actually worked incredibly well over the last 8 weeks. There's nothing like a good crisis to force you to focus your mind. And that is what they have done. And it has been really refreshing not to see the sort of political partisanship that sometimes you would see play out in the normal day-to-day of politics. My observation would be that I think all premiers and chief ministers and the Prime Minister have recognised that that's actually an incredibly valuable thing that has come out of the way the National Cabinet has been working together. And yeah, I would be surprised if they didn't seek to adopt what's actually worked incredibly well for what is still a very long task ahead of us. Like, we can get through the health pandemic, but then we've got the economic recovery challenge, which is probably going to take longer than the health pandemic, frankly. So, I remain optimistic that what's been achieved through National Cabinet could continue. So I think the political class will want to do this.
Brian, did you have?
Yeah, I just think I think Sarah hit on the key word there, that the crisis has brought people together, and I think there's some new structures that are put in place, and they make a lot of sense. The National Cabinet model, as opposed to, say, going back to the COAG model for green processes that affect all states and the national economy. I think the problems, though, we still have to deal with the legacy of our federation, which, with all the best intention in the world, I suspect, once the crisis has passed and the danger is forgotten, that we sadly will probably revert to our own ways. But hopefully, with some better structures in place and some more optimism around what can be achieved as a united group. But I wouldn't bank on it. I wouldn't bank on it.
Yeah, you can't rule out funding squabbles between states and territories and the Commonwealth. That will probably be with us forever.
I wanted to turn to a question about actually one thing that came up at National Cabinet this week around mental health, and we've had 10 weeks of lockdown, including a lot of people in isolation and separated from friends and family and loved ones, plus the economic impact of the pandemic. It's obviously a big focus for government at state and federal level, but what is going to be the long-term impact, positive or negative, in terms of mental health in this country? Rebecca, do you want to kick off?
Well, from a social research perspective, one of the things that, I know this sounds kind of really glib, but one of the things that this has reinforced to me is the critical role of green space in local communities. We are blessed to be able to communicate via Zoom and, be able to do, yoga classes at home. But really, in terms of being able to be, able to manage mental health, and also to be able to feel connected to community, if you don't have walkable streets, safe walkable streets, and green space to be able to do things, then the impact on your community and yourself has got to be worse. I mean, where I was thinking about that in the context of a really interesting study that had been done by epidemiologists in America, looking at the impact of climate change on young people and mental health and delinquency. And they found that in areas in which there was higher temperatures, there was actually an increase in mental health in young people and delinquency. But the thing that offset it was if you were in a community that had green space, significant green space. And so I think that this has reinforced the importance of maintaining those, and in fact even expanding them, and making sure that those green spaces are both safe and climate and ready for the challenges of climate change. I think that, as I said before we went online, I'm interested broadly about whether the impact on mental health, which is, we're going to find out what that is in the coming months, about whether that isn't quite as bad as we expected it to be, because everybody is being affected. And so whether there's some kind of mitigation in solidarity, which is that everybody's going through it, and perhaps there's that sense too that with the government stepping forward that there is at least some social safety net. I say that again speculatively because I'm not quite sure how that pans out. But yeah, those are my two reflections really on the mental health question.
Does anybody else want to chime in? Brian?
Yeah, just a couple of observations. I think I'm certainly not an expert in this space, but I get a sense that, the community is also at the moment still has adrenaline running through their veins about dealing with the crisis, and as a function of being in that position, the reality of some of the longer term consequences probably haven't yet arrived, possibly. So that is to emerge as the restrictions start to get lifted. And an interesting anecdote, certainly not backed up by any research, but I reckon that there is a cohort that has got used to the lockdown and the work from home environment, and the opportunity to engage with community and families, etc. So that when things start to return to normal, that they actually might have the mental health impact moving away from this period of complete change that's really been quite enlightening for many people.
It's kind of that data point, Brian, showing that people who are more likely to want to work from home in future are people who live with an elderly person or look after an elderly person who probably quite enjoyed it. And, you know, we've sort of found that people have been using that time of not commuting to go for walks and exercise and sleep in and have longer meals and all those types of things. So
there's been no FOMO either, because you haven't been missing out on anything. So.
There certainly hasn't been a lot of nostalgia for very long commutes on crowded public transport, but I think perhaps people's tolerance, this event notwithstanding of Zoom meetings, might be kind of reaching a certain level. But Sarah, did you have any thoughts on this?
Look, not really, other than, I guess, and I don't want to end on a grim note, but I guess pulling together a couple of the other threads the guys just said, I think the bit we need to watch out for are people who struggle with their mental health as a result of the economic challenges that are ahead of us. That's the bit that I know that National Cabinet has been considering. Some of you will have seen the Prime Minister announced today that a lot of work has been done on a sort of national mental health plan. Part of that, there's an emphasis on making sure that we're not just looking at what would you say, the traditional cohort of people who may have mental health challenges, but we're also looking across all the touch points of government, including where people are, you know, logging calls about financial distress. That's the piece that people are pretty worried about. So.
I do want to end on a more optimistic note,
good,
because it has been an incredibly hard. Well, we talked at the beginning of the session that it's been an incredibly hard year for the country, but you know, there is a sense of pride in the way that the country has sort of come together and actually responded to the crisis, you know, really well and really sensibly. Any reflections on what this says about modern Australia and our sort of resilience and our spirit?
I think I said it before. I think it says a lot for our resilience and our spirit. And in fact, if you were having a performance development discussion or a performance review, there's usually a section about what's your resilience like. And I think everybody in Australia would pass with flying colours, frankly.
I hope it shows people that we can collectively change the way we live in response to a crisis, which is as much about other people than it is about how it affects other people than it affects you. So what are the data generally showed that people, over time, that people thought it was much more likely that somebody else would get COVID than they would. So while people were concerned about them getting it or somebody they knew, they thought it was much more likely that somebody else would get it, and that's happened over time. So essentially we're staying home not just to protect ourselves, but to protect people we'll never meet. And that's actually really critical, to think that we can do that. I mean, whether we can sustain that over time in a way in response to climate change, which feels less immediate and less in our face and much more kind of extensive and also much more politicised, is another question. But I hope we have built some confidence in our ability to do that, and built some confidence that our leaders, not just our political leaders, but people like Sarah in the bureaucracy, some community leaders, some business leaders, can also step up and be part of that solution.
Thank you. And Brian and Sue?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I know it's something that's uniquely Australian potentially. You see some of the imagery from overseas of the discourse in the US in particular, and you think, you know, that's never really been part of the Australian society. And I think we're very fortunate that, you know, through all crises, through depressions, world wars, etc., there's always been this united perspective, even though we're regarded as having a general lack of respect for authority. I think when there is a crisis, you know, people just seem to pull together, and I think it's just something that we should be proud of as a country, and it's, you know, this unique resilience we seem to have. It will certainly be tested over the coming weeks and months, though.
And I'll just back what Brian said. I just think that thing about Australians all acting together, and we're not seeing the splintering like we're seeing in the US. You know, that whole thing that most people think they're on the track, most people are pulling their weight. I just think that's fantastic.
Fantastic. We have unfortunately come to the end of our session, which is a great shame, because we could talk about these issues for much longer. If this was a physical Committee for Sydney event, we might all toddle off for a glass of wine, but sadly we'll have to do that virtually, or if you're lucky enough to be one of the 10 people going to the pub, enjoy that. Can I just say a huge thank you to our presenters and panellists, Sarah Cruickshank, Rebecca Huntley, Brian Tyson and Sarah Virkow. Thank you to everybody for watching and for all of your questions. Tune in to CFS Live next week. We've got a full programme, including Jeff Roberts and Sarah Hill from the GSC. We have the head of the San Francisco Transport Agency, and a heavyweight debate with two public policy giants, Peter Shergold and Michael Parkinson. Until then, thanks very much for joining us. Stay safe and have a great weekend.
See you.
Thanks, James.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.